I stopped outside the glass conference room when I heard her voice drop. She said, "We can't keep pretending he's ready." Someone laughed softly. Another voice answered, "Once the transfer is done, he won't matter." I didn't move. I counted my breaths. The company logo reflected in the glass looked unfamiliar, like it belonged to strangers discussing a man who was already gone. My name hung there, silent, erased, heavier than any insult I had survived before that day inside. I leaned against the wall and listened. She said, "We need someone stronger beside me." A man replied, "I can step in when he slows you down." My hands shook. I remembered her whispering, "We'll build this together." I had believed every word. Now they spoke about my life like a faulty plan being quietly replaced. Their voices sounded calm, certain, already finished with me as a problem they saw solved permanently. I backed away before the door opened. I sat alone in my office, lights off, phone buzzing unanswered. I replayed her promises out loud, mocking myself. "Trust me," she had said. "I love you." The words felt hollow now. Fear crept in, then rage, then a quiet shame. I realized no one would defend me. They had already written my ending without asking. Every success I built was being handed over politely. My absence was being planned while I still breathed. I felt small, disposable, painfully aware that love and loyalty had limits I never saw coming. The silence in that room pressed on me harder than any shouted betrayal ever could, and it stayed with me that night alone. I didn't confront her. I didn't storm in. I sat there, remembering our first deal, our first kiss, our shared dreams. I asked myself, when did I become expendable? My chest hurt. I knew if I spoke, I would beg or break. Instead, I listened to the truth settle. If they could erase me this easily, then the man I was no longer existed. Love didn't vanish in one moment. It thinned slowly, like air leaving a room. I finally understood how people disappear while standing in plain sight. They needed my silence more than my presence, and I was tired of fighting ghosts who smiled. I closed my eyes, let the pain wash through me, and felt something inside me harden. That moment marked the end of trusting love and the birth of a colder resolve inside my chest. I stayed until the office emptied. I whispered goodbye to the life I built. "If I'm already dead to you," I told the dark room, "then I'll stop breathing for you too." It wasn't drama. It was survival. Fear and relief mixed as one thought formed clearly. I would disappear, legally, completely, and leave them nothing but my shadow. I knew the risk, the loneliness, the cost. Yet staying meant watching myself erased slowly, piece by piece, while smiling faces held the knife. That night, the decision settled deep. I would die on paper and finally live in truth. The man they planned without me would never hear my name again, because I had chosen to vanish first myself forever. I walked out before dawn. The city felt unchanged, indifferent. No calls came, no messages followed. I understood then that my death had started before any certificate. As the sun rose, I promised myself one thing. If I vanished, it would be on my terms, not theirs. I didn't know how or when, but I felt the shift inside me begin quietly. Behind me lay love and betrayal. That promise was the first step toward becoming someone they could never control again. Ahead waited silence, risk, and a different kind of freedom that I was finally ready to claim alone. I sat across from my lawyer and said, "I want to be declared dead." He blinked. "That isn't funny." "I'm not joking," I said. "I need everything erased." He leaned back. "You're talking about fraud." "I'm talking about survival." He asked, "Is someone threatening you?" "No," I said. "They already replaced me." He studied my face. "You built this company." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm giving it away." "To her?" He asked. "Yes." Silence stretched. He finally said, "This will destroy you." "I'm already destroyed," I replied. He slid documents toward me. "Once this starts, there's no return." I nodded. "That's the point." "You'll lose your name," he said. "I don't recognize it anymore." He sighed. "You sound calm." "I'm numb," I said. He warned me about audits, enemies, people inside the company who would benefit from my disappearance. "They're already celebrating," I said. He didn't argue. The doctor's office smelled like antiseptic and silence. The doctor asked softly, "Do you understand the risk?" "Yes," I said. "You could actually die." "Then it wouldn't be a lie." He checked my pulse. "Why do this?" "Because staying hurts more," I said. Forms were signed. Dates were chosen. The doctor said, once recorded, you legally cease to exist. I asked, how long until it's official? 24 hours. I went back to my lawyer. He said, your will leaves everything to her. I asked, does it look generous? It looks final, he said. My hand shook as I signed. Is this love? I asked, or revenge? He said, only you can answer that. Night fell when the call came. Your death certificate has been issued, he said. I thanked him. I stood alone, breathing, legally gone. I whispered, I'm still here. No one answered. On paper, I was dead, and the world kept moving. The lawyer called again. He said, people inside the board are already asking questions. I said, let them. They'll fight over your seat, he warned. Good, I said. Let them show themselves. He hesitated. You can still stop this. I won't, I said. Why? Because staying means begging. He lowered his voice. She signed the acceptance. I asked, did she cry? Yes, he said. I laughed softly. She always cries when things work out, he said. That was cruel. I learned from the best, I replied. When the call ended, the doctor returned. He asked, any regrets? I said, only that I waited. He nodded. I looked at my reflection and said, remember this face. No one answered. I packed nothing sentimental, I said out loud. Memories way too much. As I walked out, my phone buzzed. Her name flashed. I turned it off. I told myself, dead men don't explain. The silence agreed. I felt fear rise. I said, this is courage. My voice shook. I reminded myself, this isn't escape. It's rebirth, I answered. Somewhere. My company was celebrating continuity. I whispered, enjoy the inheritance. I stepped into the night and said, from now on, I belong to myself. I paused under a streetlight and said, no witnesses. The air stayed quiet. I rehearsed lies I would never tell. I said, I died clean. I imagined her reading the will. I asked, do you feel safe now? I answered myself, you chose comfort. My chest tightened. I said, this hurts. I waited. I reminded myself, pain fades. I replied, so does love. I checked the time. I said, it's done. Somewhere, paperwork locked my fate. I whispered, stay dead. I walked forward and said, don't look back. I breathed slowly. I said, this is real. My hands steadied. I promised myself, survive quietly. I answered, I will. The night swallowed me. I didn't resist. I stepped away knowing nothing could undo this choice. Any more tonight alone now, forever onward. I stood across the street, collar pulled up, watching people enter the hall where my name was printed in black. A man beside me said, such a shame. He was young. Another replied, these things happen. I almost laughed. Inside, a woman whispered, life moves fast. I repeated that in my head. Life moves fast. Apparently, it moves faster without me. I slipped inside and stayed near the back. Someone said he worked too much. Another voice answered, at least he left her everything. I clenched my jaw. A man muttered, lucky woman. No one corrected him. I realized grief had a price tag now, and my absence was already profitable to someone smiling politely. She sat in the front row, dressed in black, shoulders shaking. A woman leaned close and whispered, you were so strong. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I had to be, she said. Her voice cracked perfectly. I watched carefully. The tears looked real, but they ended too quickly. She didn't look back, not even once, like she was afraid of seeing something unfinished. A man stood beside her, hand hovering near her arm, too close. He said softly, you did everything you could. She whispered, I know. My chest tightened. I remembered him clearly. He used to wait outside my office for approval. Now he stood where I once belonged. Someone behind me asked, who's that? Another replied, he's helping her run things now. I swallowed hard. A speaker cleared his throat. He was a visionary, the man said. But the company will continue. Continue, the word echoed. No pause, no hesitation, just continue. I heard someone say she remarry someday. Another answered, soon probably. They laughed quietly. My hands curled into fists inside my pockets. I moved closer. A woman whispered, she must be relieved. Her friend said, don't say that. The first replied, I didn't mean it badly. I thought you meant it honestly. Honesty comes out when the dead can't argue back. I realized people weren't cruel. They were practical. My death solved problems they never admitted existed. She stood to speak. He believed in loyalty, she said. He trusted deeply. I felt something break cleanly inside me. The man beside her nodded, like he agreed. She added, I promised to protect what he built. Applause followed. I stayed still. That promise wasn't for me. It was for the room, for the board, for the future she already stepped into. Someone brushed past me and said, funerals are for closure. I thought closure is a luxury for the living. Another voice said, I barely knew him. Someone replied, none of us really do. I wondered how many nights I worked late to earn that sentence. Too many, apparently. As people filed out, I heard plans forming. We'll meet Monday. The merger can move forward now. She needs support. The man at her side said, I'm here. She squeezed his hand. Not tightly, comfortably. Like it had happened before. My grief shifted. It sharpened into clarity. This wasn't sudden, it was prepared. I stepped outside before the final prayer. The air felt lighter, like the world had already adjusted. I said quietly, that's it. No one heard. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Anger needs hope. I felt finished. I understood I could never return as the man I was. He was buried properly, with speeches and plans and replacement hands. I walked away as they closed the doors. I told myself, you saw enough. The city didn't pause. Cars passed. People laughed nearby. I didn't exist. And for the first time, that truth felt clear instead of painful. I left knowing whoever I became next could never stand in that room again. That man was mourned, replaced, and already forgotten by most. I ordered coffee using a name that didn't belong to me. The barista asked, first time here? I said, yes. She smiled. You'll get used to the taste. I thought, I'll have to. I rented a small room above a shop. The owner said, no guests, no noise. That's perfect, I replied. He laughed. Most people don't say that. I'm not most people, I said, and meant it more than he knew. At night, I spoke to myself. You're safe, I said. Another voice answered. You're alone. Both were true. At a market, an old man selling books looked at me and said, you walk like you're hiding. I asked, is it that obvious? He said, to someone who's done it. I bought a book I didn't plan to read. The next day I came back. He said, running again? I replied, standing still felt worse. He nodded. Sit. We shared tea. He asked, what did you lose? I said, everything. He corrected me. Then why are you breathing? I didn't answer. He said, people who lose everything usually want revenge. I don't, I said. He smiled. That's a lie you tell yourself. I snapped, you don't know me. He said calmly, I know pain when it talks too much. That shut me up. I returned often. He said, what's your name? I gave him the new one. He raised an eyebrow. That's not it. It is now, I replied. He said, victims rename themselves. Survivors earn names. I asked, which am I? He said, you're still deciding. One night I admitted, I feel guilty for leaving. He asked, did staying save anyone? No. Then stop punishing yourself, he said. I said, they took everything. He replied, no. You handed it over. That hurt more than betrayal. I argued, I loved her. He said, love doesn't require self-erasure. I whispered, it felt like it did. He answered, then it wasn't love. Weeks passed, I learned the city's sounds, its pace. A neighbor said, you're quiet. I said, I listen. She smiled. That's rare. Some nights anger returned. I said aloud, they're winning. The old man replied, only if you're still playing their game. I asked, what game should I play? He said, build a life that doesn't need witnesses. I started working small jobs. A coworker asked, where are you from? I said, far. He laughed, everyone here is. I stopped checking old news. I stopped rehearsing speeches. I said to myself, breathe. And I did. One evening, the old man said, you don't talk like a ghost anymore. I asked, what do I sound like? He replied, like a man who's tired of blaming. I looked at my hands and said, I don't know who I am yet. He said, good, that means you're alive. When I walked home, I didn't feel strong, but I felt grounded. I said quietly, I'm still here. No one answered. For the first time, that felt enough. I was waiting for my coffee when someone behind me said, did you see what happened to that company? I froze. Another voice replied, the one whose founder died? I kept my head down. The barista asked, sugar? I said no too quickly. My phone buzzed with a notification I hadn't searched for, like the past had found me instead. A man laughed and said, "She really turned it around." His friend said, "Turned it around or tore it apart?" They pulled up a video. I watched reflections in the screen before I saw it clearly. A reporter said, "Once a symbol of stability, the company now faces multiple lawsuits." I felt my stomach tighten. The word lawsuits echoed louder than the music in the cafe. I whispered to myself, "Don't watch." Another part of me said, "You need to." The video continued. Sources say internal power struggles began months after the founder's tragic death. Tragic. I tasted that word. A woman at the next table said, "Poor guy. He worked himself to death." Her friend answered, "At least she's strong enough to handle the mess." I wrapped my hands around the cup, steadying them. A new clip auto-played. She stood at a podium and said, "We are restructuring to protect our future." Someone off camera asked, "What about the allegations?" She smiled and replied, "Change is never clean." I almost choked on my coffee. That was my line once. She had learned it well. A comment scrolled past. He would be disappointed. Another said, he left her everything. What did he expect? I felt heat rise in my chest. I remembered signing those papers, thinking love or guilt made it noble. Hearing strangers judge a dead man hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. The barista said, "You okay?" I nodded. "Just tired." He said, "News does that to people." I scrolled further. Headlines mentioned settlements, silent partners, sudden resignations. A man in the cafe said, "Funny how problems started after he died." His friend replied, "Yeah, but no one blames the dead." I thought, they blame me just enough to excuse everything else. Another article quoted a former employee. "He trusted the wrong people," I said quietly. That part is true. No one heard. The room smelled like roasted beans and normal life, and I felt far from normal. I wasn't healing anymore. I was waking up. My phone vibrated again. An old alert I never unsubscribed from showed a panel discussion. One speaker said, "His absence created a vacuum." Another replied, "Vacuum attracts opportunists." I shut the app, then opened it again. I needed to know how deep it went. I said under my breath, "So that's how you did it." The truth wasn't dramatic. It was messy, quiet, profitable. I paid and stepped outside. The sun felt harsh. I told myself, "You walked away." Another voice answered, "You were pushed." For 3 years, I chose peace over memory. Standing there, listening to my name reduced to a lesson, I felt something shift. I wasn't angry like before. I was alert. I said, "Healing is done." I looked back at the cafe and whispered, "Now I'm awake." A man bumped my shoulder and said, "Sorry." I replied, "It's fine." But it wasn't. I walked slowly and argued with myself. "Let it go," I said. Another voice replied, "You already tried." I stopped and said aloud, "What do you want?" Silence answered, then clarity. I wanted understanding, not revenge. I wanted control over my own story again. I remembered the old man's words about games. This one had resumed without my permission. I said, if they're rewriting me, I should read the draft. My hands stopped shaking. I felt calm in a dangerous way, like standing before a storm knowing exactly where to place my feet. I walked on, listening carefully, knowing the past had caught up. I sat across the table and said, "I'm interested in a quiet position." The man frowned. "Quiet doesn't exist here." "It does if you know where to stand," I replied. He studied my documents and asked, "Why this company?" I said, "Because it's unstable." He smiled. "You sound confident." "I'm careful," I said. He asked, "Name?" I gave him the new one. He nodded. "Background?" "Clean," I answered. A week later, I entered the building I once ruled. The receptionist asked, "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said. "I'm early." She smiled. "Everyone important is—" In the meeting room, a man whispered, "Do you remember the founder?" Another replied, "Hard to forget." I kept my eyes on the table. Someone said, "He trusted too much." Another answered, "That killed him." I swallowed and spoke. "What's killing the company now?" They turned to me. A woman said, "Lack of unity." A man added, "Too many egos." I nodded, "That's expensive." They agreed quickly. After the meeting, a former manager approached me. He said, "You remind me of him." I asked, "In what way?" He shrugged. "The way you listen." We walked together. He said, "He used to ask questions before decisions." I said, "Smart habit." He sighed. We don't do that anymore. In a private office, someone said, we need capital without noise. I replied, noise attracts attention. They asked, are you afraid? No, I said. I'm patient. Numbers moved. Signatures followed. No one noticed how control shifted inch by inch. At lunch, a woman laughed and said, she runs things with fear now. Another replied, fear keeps people loyal. I said quietly, until it doesn't. They looked at me. I added, fear leaks. No one argued. Later, a junior analyst said, if he were alive, this wouldn't be happening. I asked, why? He wouldn't allow it, she said. I thanked her and walked away before my voice changed. In another room, a man complained, we lost our soul. Someone answered, we gained profit. I said, souls are harder to replace. Silence followed. Each conversation cut deep, each memory sharpened focus. I wasn't angry, I was precise. During a call, someone asked, do you trust leadership? I said, I trust incentives. They laughed nervously. I watched alliances form and break. I said nothing. I remembered everything. A former assistant looked at me and said, you feel familiar. I replied, people say that. She smiled. He used to stand like you? I said, still? She answered, no. He stood taller. That hurt. I accepted it. By evening, votes leaned my way. No announcements. No applause. A man said, you move quietly. I answered, quiet survives. As I left, someone said, things are changing. I said, they always do. Outside, I breathed deeply. I told myself, this isn't revenge. Another voice replied, it's balance. I checked my phone and saw her name trending again. I turned it off. I said aloud, one step at a time. The game hadn't restarted loudly. It didn't need to. I was back inside it, unseen, steady, and no longer disposable. I recognized her voice before I saw her face. She said, I'm running late again, and the words hit me harder than I expected. I looked up slowly. She stood across the table, confident posture, tired eyes. She didn't recognize me. That was the point. I said, no problem. My voice sounded steady. Inside, WASN single quotes T. She sat and said, thank you for meeting. I replied, of course. She studied the menu and said, I don't usually eat anymore. I asked, too busy? She smiled thinly. Too much pressure. The waiter left. Silence filled the space between us. She broke it. You've been involved with the company for a while. Yes, I said. She nodded. It's complicated now, I asked. In what way? She exhaled. Everyone expects strength. I said, do they allow weakness? She laughed softly. No. She looked at her hands. I didn't think it would be this lonely. I asked, leadership? Survival, she corrected. I felt my chest tighten. I said carefully, you seem capable. She shook her head. Capable doesn't mean prepared. She glanced up. Have you ever lost someone important? Yes, I said. More than once. She nodded like that answer mattered. She said, people think I won. I asked, did you? Her lips pressed together. I don't know. The waiter returned. She ordered without looking. I asked, do you regret anything? She froze. Then she said, every night. I waited. She continued, I regret choices made in silence. My pulse thud. I asked, why silence? She said, because honesty would have changed everything. I looked at her and said, sometimes silence is a decision. She flinched. Yes. She stared out the window. I thought strength meant moving forward. I said, sometimes it means stopping. She smiled sadly. I didn't know how. She leaned closer and whispered, do you believe people can live with what they've done? I answered, only if they face it. Her eyes filled, but she blinked it away. She said, I don't think I've faced anything. I wanted to say my name. I wanted to ask why. I didn't. She said, he trusted me completely. I said, trust is heavy. She nodded. I dropped it. The words cut clean. She didn't know why. She straightened and said, I'm sorry. That was unprofessional. I replied, it was honest. She studied me. You're hard to read. I said, I learned to be. She laughed quietly. I envy that. I asked, why? Because everyone reads me wrong, she said. I said, or too easily. She didn't disagree. She checked her phone and sighed. Another crisis, she said. I asked, do they ever stop? She said, only when I do. I said gently. You don't sound rested. She replied, I don't sleep. I stood. We should continue this later. She nodded. Yes. As we walked out, she said, Thank you for listening. I answered, Someone should. She paused. You feel familiar. I smiled faintly. So do regrets. She watched me leave. I didn't look back. Outside, my hands shook. I whispered, Not yet. I walked away carrying her confession, my name still buried, and the knowledge that cracks had finally begun to show. I closed the door and said, I need the truth. The man across from me hesitated. You don't want it. I already have pieces, I said. Fill the gaps. He rubbed his forehead. He positioned himself early. Who? I asked. The one always near her now. I said, He stood beside her at my funeral. The man nodded. That was intentional. I leaned forward. Explain. He fed her fear, he said. Slowly. I asked, Fear of what? Of failing alone, he replied. Of losing control. Another voice joined the call. He made himself necessary. I asked, How? By warning her, the voice said. About everyone, I said, including me? Silence answered first. Then, yes. My chest tightened. What did he say? That you were tired, the voice said. That you were holding her back. I laughed once. That sounds familiar, the first man said. She listened. I asked, Because she believed him? Because she was scared, he replied. I paced and said, Did she know what she was doing? Yes, he said. And no, I stopped. That's not an answer. It is, he insisted. She didn't plan the fall. I said, But she accepted the landing. He exhaled. Exactly. Another insider spoke. He pushed. She agreed. I asked, Did anyone stop them? No, came the reply. I said quietly, Comfort over loyalty. No one argued. I asked, When did it cross the line? When she stopped asking questions, someone said. I remembered her words about silence, I said. She chose quiet. A woman on the call said, She thought you were strong enough to survive. I replied, She was wrong. Someone added, He told her you'd forgive anything. That hurt more than anger ever did. I said, He knew me. He studied you, the man replied. I asked, And now? He's exposed, the voice said. Barely holding things together. I closed my eyes. Does she know? Yes, came the answer. Too late. I leaned back and said, So she wasn't evil. No, they said. She was afraid, I finished. Silence settled. I asked, Is fear an excuse? No one answered. After the call, I sat alone and spoke out loud. She chose him. Another voice in me replied, She chose herself. I said, At my cost. Yes, the voice agreed. I replayed every sign I ignored. I said, Weakness hides behind ambition. I remembered her tired eyes. I said, She didn't want power. She wanted safety, I answered myself. The question pressed in. What is justice? I said, Is it punishment? Another thought replied, Or truth. I pictured the man who replaced me. I said, He manipulated. But she allowed it. I finished. My anger softened to something heavier. Understanding. I said, If I destroy him, what does that fix? Nothing answered. I said, If I expose her, what remains? Silence again. I stood and said, Justice isn't balance. It's choice, I replied. I walked to the window and whispered, I won't pretend she's innocent. I paused, and I won't pretend she's a monster. I breathed slowly. I said, Weakness still has consequences. The city lights flickered. I said, So do decisions. I knew then this wasn't about revenge. It was about ending a lie. I picked up my phone and said, One move left. Not against her. Not against him. For myself. She stood in front of me and said my name. Not the new one. The old one. The dead one. My chest tightened, but my face didn't move. She whispered, It's you. I nodded once. She stepped back like the floor had cracked. You're dead, she said. I replied, Only on paper. Her voice rose. Do you know what you did to me? I answered, Yes. She shook her head. No, you disappeared. I said, You erased me first. Tears spilled fast now. That's not fair. I replied, Neither was planning my replacement. She covered her mouth. You heard that? I heard enough, I said. She stepped closer. Why didn't you stop me? I asked calmly. Why didn't you stop yourself? Her hands trembled. I was scared. I know, I said. You don't, she snapped. I do, I replied. That's why I left. She cried, you let me think you were dead. I said, you let yourself move on quickly. She shouted, I cried for you. I answered, I watched. That broke her. She sank into the chair and said, say something human. I said, I loved you. She looked up. Loved? Yes, I said. Past tense. Her voice cracked. I didn't plan for this. I nodded. You still chose it. She stood again. He manipulated me. I know, I said. You knew? Yes. She pleaded. Then why punish me? I replied, I didn't. She laughed bitterly. You disappeared. I survived, I corrected. She asked, was I that easy to abandon? I answered, I was that easy to replace. Silence fell heavy. She whispered, I never wanted to hurt you. I said, intent doesn't erase outcome. She wiped her face. I was drowning. And I was already underwater, I replied. She stepped closer again. Say it. Say you hate me. I shook my head. I don't. Her eyes widened. Then what do you feel? I said, clarity. She grabbed my arm. I lost everything. I gently removed her hand. You gained control. She cried, I didn't know the cost. I said, you did. You accepted it. She sank back and whispered, I'm sorry. I nodded. I know. She looked up sharply. That's it? That's the truth, I said. She asked, why come back? I didn't, I replied. You found me, her voice softened. Are you happy? I paused. I'm honest. She laughed through tears. You always wanted that. Yes, I said. She said, I thought you were weak. I answered, I was loyal. She covered her face. I ruined us. I said, you chose comfort. She whispered, and you chose death. I replied, I chose life. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. She said, I don't know who you are. I said, neither did you when it mattered. Her shoulders shook. Can we fix this? I said quietly, no. She froze. Why? Because this moment is the truth, I said. She asked, do you forgive me? I thought, then said, I understand you. She cried harder. That's worse. I answered, it's freedom. I stood. She didn't stop me. She said, so this is it? Yes, I replied. I walked to the door. She whispered, I loved you. I turned and said, I believe you. Then I left, knowing the truth had finally been spoken, and nothing louder was needed ever again. She came without warning, no assistance, no schedule request. Just a knock. I opened the door and she stood there, smaller than I remembered. She said, I didn't know where else to go. I stepped aside. You found it anyway, I replied. She entered slowly, like the room might reject her. She looked around and said, you live simply. I answered, I learned how. She sat and folded her hands. Everything collapsed, I asked. All of it? Yes, she said. Career, allies, trust, I nodded. That happens, she winced. You sound detached. I am, I said. She swallowed. I deserved that. I didn't answer, she said. They turned on me. I asked, did you expect loyalty? Her voice broke. I thought I earned it, I said. You borrowed it. She closed her eyes. She whispered, I lost myself. I replied, you misplaced yourself. She looked up. What's the difference? Choice, I said. Silence stretched. She finally said, I'm tired. I answered, I can see that. She laughed weakly. I used to think rest was weakness, I said. It still is, if you never stop. She looked at me carefully. Do you hate me? I shook my head. No, she whispered. That scares me more. I said, it shouldn't. She stood and paced. I keep replaying everything, I said. So do I. She stopped. Do you remember our plans? Yes, I said. Do they hurt? Not anymore. She sat again. I'm alone. I replied, so am I. She looked up sharply. That's not the same. It is, I said. I just accepted it. She leaned forward. I don't want power. I said, I know. She whispered, I want home. I answered, home isn't a person. Her eyes filled. You were. I said softly, you turned it into a position. She covered her face. I was wrong, I said, yes. She lowered her hands. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I waited. She said, I'm asking for us. I took a breath. She looked at me and said, marry me. The word hung there. I didn't react. She rushed on. Not for protection, not for money, I asked. Then why? Because I know what I lost, she said. I asked. And what did you lose? You, she replied. I nodded. You lost yourself first. She cried quietly. I'm empty. I said, marriage doesn't fill that. She whispered, I'll change. I replied, change isn't a promise, it's proof. She reached for my hand and stopped herself. She said, I don't deserve another chance. I said, you're right. She looked shattered. I continued, that doesn't mean you're nothing. She asked, then what am I asking? I said, for time to undo a choice. She said, I'd give anything. I replied, you already did. Silence settled gently. She said, I miss who I was with you. I answered, I don't. She looked confused. I said, I outgrew that version. She whispered, so this is goodbye? I paused. This is honesty. She nodded slowly. That hurts, I said. Truth usually does. She stood. Thank you for listening. I replied, I always did. At the door she turned. I loved you. I said, I know. She left quietly. I stayed still, knowing some things are lost not to cruelty, but to choice. I sat alone after she left and said, this is over. The room answered with silence. I asked myself, is that enough? Another voice replied, it has to be. I walked to the window and said, you could punish her. The reflection answered, would that heal you? I paced and spoke aloud. She chose comfort. I stopped. You chose survival. I asked, is forgiveness weakness? I answered, only when it erases truth. I remembered her eyes when she asked me to marry her. I said she wanted relief. Another thought replied, you want peace. My phone buzzed. Her name appeared. I didn't answer. I said, not yet. I sat and rehearsed words I never planned to say. I don't hate you. I don't want revenge. I'm done bleeding. Each sentence felt heavy, but clean. A knock came. I opened the door. She stood there again, eyes red, voice steady. I forgot something, she said. I replied, you forgot many things. She flinched. I need an answer, she said. I nodded. You'll get one. She asked, did you think about it? I said, constantly. She whispered, and? I invited her in. Sit, I said. She sat. I stood. I needed the distance. She said, I'm not asking twice. I replied, I'm not giving the same answer. She frowned. What does that mean? I took a breath. It means I won't marry you. Her shoulders dropped. She said, I expected that. I continued, but I won't punish you either. She looked up sharply. Why? I said, because punishment keeps us tied. She whispered, then what do you want? I answered, closure. She shook her head. I don't understand. I said, I forgive you without returning. Her eyes widened. That's impossible. I replied, it's necessary. She asked, for who? I said, for me. She stood. So I lose everything? I answered, you lost it when you chose safety over loyalty. She cried, I'm paying now. I nodded. I see that. She asked, isn't that enough? I said, it is, for me. She stepped closer. Say you still care. I said, I care about who I became. She whispered, that's cruel. I replied, it's honest. She asked, do you love me? I paused. I respect the past, she pressed. That's not an answer. I said, it's the only one that doesn't lie. She sat slowly. I thought revenge would be louder. I said, so did I. She asked, then this is it? I nodded. This is me choosing myself. She wiped her face. I didn't expect this. I said, neither did I. She asked, what should I do? I replied, live with your choices. She whispered, and you? I said, live free. She walked to the door and stopped. Thank you for not destroying me, I answered. Thank you for teaching me. She left. I locked the door and said, I'm done. I sat on the floor and laughed once. That was the answer, I told myself. Another voice asked, are you sure? I said yes. I stood and said, I don't need witnesses. I poured water and said, two endings. I drank and added, two beginnings. I checked the mirror and said, you survived. I replied, barely. I said, you chose dignity. I answered, finally. I listened for regret. None came. I said, this is closure. The silence didn't argue. It felt earned, calm, and mine alone at last. I turned off the lights and said, tomorrow matters. I answered myself, only if you show up. I smiled and whispered, I will. I slept knowing the hardest answer was choosing me. I woke briefly and said, "Stay," I answered. "I am." Morning arrived quietly. I said, "Begin." My voice answered, "Now." I stood ready. I whispered, "Choose yourself daily." I nodded, breathing steady, present, free. This time I meant it completely. Always. Forward. Unafraid now. At peace. Here. Alone. Finally. Today awake. Always. I woke before sunrise and said, "I'm still here." No one answered, and for once I didn't need anyone to. I stood by the window and whispered, "You survived." My reflection looked back and said, "You changed." I nodded slowly. Change used to scare me. Now it felt earned. I poured coffee and said, "This is enough." The room stayed quiet. I asked myself, "Do you miss her?" The answer came without delay. I miss who I was before I doubted myself. That truth settled calmly. Missing the past didn't mean living in it. I sat and listed losses out loud. I lost love, I said. I lost certainty. I lost a future I imagined. Then I paused and added, I gained truth. That one outweighed the rest. Truth didn't comfort me, but it steadied me. I remembered the man who chose death to survive. I said, he was desperate. Then I followed with, I'm deliberate. The difference mattered. Desperation runs. Deliberation walks forward without apology. My phone buzzed once. A message read, board meeting cancelled. I smiled and said, good. Quiet justice didn't need witnesses or headlines. It arrived when balance returned, not when someone screamed. I stepped outside and breathed deeply. A neighbor waved and said, morning. I replied, morning, and meant it. I walked without hiding. I said, you don't owe explanations. Another thought answered, you don't owe punishment either. That felt lighter than forgiveness. I passed a mirror in a shop window and said, you're not broken. I corrected myself. You're rebuilt. Every scar carried instruction. Every loss carried direction. I remembered every warning I ignored. I said, that pain taught me. Another voice replied, it didn't define you. I held on to that. Lessons shape you. They don't cage you. I reached a quiet park and sat. A child laughed nearby. I smiled without guilt. Happiness didn't need permission anymore. I spoke softly and said, I didn't die for nothing. I lost comfort. I gained clarity. I lost certainty. I gained choice. I said, I forgive myself. That mattered most. I stood and said, I release the past. The past didn't argue. It finally let go because I did first. I checked the sky and said, forward. My heart answered, steady. I knew loneliness would return sometimes. I said, that's human. Strength didn't mean never hurting. It meant not surrendering to it. I would build carefully now. Not loudly. Not to prove anything. I whispered, strength can be quiet. That sentence felt like a promise I could keep. I walked home and unlocked the door. I said, this life is mine. The words didn't echo. They settled. I lost a woman. I gained myself. That exchange no longer felt unfair. I turned off my phone. I sat in silence. I said, justice arrived without cruelty. I nodded. It had arrived through distance, honesty, and restraint. I lay down and closed my eyes. I felt whole. Not perfect. Whole. I promised myself. Never disappear again. I answered, I won't. I slept without fear. Morning waited patiently. When I woke, I said, begin. The world answered, now. I stepped forward alone. I stepped forward complete.